Hello, welcome to the first Beef Nutritionist webinar. I'm Marianne Fessenden from AMTS and your English language host. We will be hosting 5 webinars this year with a focus on beef nutrition. Like our dairy-focused The Nutritionist monthly webinars, these multi-language talks target nutritionists, educators, veterinarians, and progressive producers. The topics will range from precision formulation, increasing efficiency, improving animal health, providing good stewardship, guiding better economics in tight markets, to guidelines for current formulation, feeding for superior performance, and animal feeding behavior. These series are co-hosted by Paula Torillo from Cordoba, Argentina, translating for the Spanish-speaking language. A complete list of the coming speakers, topics, and dates are available on the AMTS website under webinars. There will be a question and answer period immediately following the presentation. Listeners can submit questions through me or Paula. A complete recording of archived webinars, as well as the question and answer session for each, will be available later on the AMTS website. For those of you who would listen to the presentations while driving, we have converted the videos into MP3 files that can be downloaded to your device for offline listening. First, Beef Nutritionist. For our first Beef Nutritionist, we are excited to host Dr. Ale Relling from The Ohio State Department of Animal Science. Dr. Relling achieved his PhD as well as his master's from The Ohio State. He received a DVM from the National University of La Plata in Argentina. At The Ohio State University, his focus is on beef, dairy, and sheep nutrition, with emphasis on feed efficiency and product quality. His research focuses on the biological mechanisms that regulate feed efficiency, adipose tissue metabolism, and their impact on beef, sheep, and dairy productions. Ale's talk today will be on fetal programming. I want to thank you, Ale, for joining us. I'm going to unmute you, and we'll take care of the little details that we have to do to get it so that you can present and I can attend to the room. So I'm going to...
So thank you, Marianne, and Paula, first for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to start this web seminar series in nutrition in beef cattle. As you mentioned, I do a little bit of metabolism on ruminants in general. And, you know, I wasn't sure that it was the first seminar, but I think it's a good topic to start when we start to talk about beef production and beef nutrition, to start to think what happens before the animal is born. So for this presentation today, I'm going to I have an outline what I'm going to cover. So I'm going to start to explaining what is this fetal programming and how do we get here from the perspective of animal production or ruminant productions, and then a little bit of the animals models that are there and why some animals models have more research than other ones, and then I will focus on beef production, thinking on the effects of protein and energy, and in energy I'm going to talk about sources of carbohydrates and lipids, on the effect of fetal programming, and at the end I will have 2 or 3 slides of conclusions on what I think can happen, what's going to happen with this topic in production. So to start, when I started working in big feedlots in Argentina, trying to get some energy data on trying to perform, I realized that the performance was multifactorial and the feed conversion ratio has a huge range, for 4.5 to 13 units of intake for a unit of gain. And for the sake of the presentation, I'm going to talk everything in kilograms and metric system for this presentation. So an animal can eat 4.5 kilos to gain 1, up to 13 kilos to gain 1. So it's a huge variation there. And a producer, when they get those animals, it's really hard to see how or why if they fed all the animals the same. Now, when we receive the animal, we really pay a lot of attention of the feeds. We check the quality of the feed, the macro and micro. So we check that the corn has not been cracked, that it's or that we process, but it doesn't come cracked before. We check the fiber length of how we are chopping the fiber or the silage, if we're working silage. Then we send the feed analysis to the lab to try to understand some of the nutrient composition, protein, fiber, ether extract. But the question that I'm going to try to answer today is how much, how many times do we focus on the quality of a calf that we are buying as a product? And some data in the States is that 50% or around 50% of the calves that go to feedlots are sold in action cells. So you can see that there is not a huge control of the calf that we buy, and it's a huge investment. And I think here is where we need to pay a little bit more attention, and that's the idea of the talk for today. So this fetal development of fetal programming, we can characterize as changes that happen during gestation and in the mother, and these changes could be nutritional or endocrine changes that what are going to happen during the fetal life will affect the adult life of that offspring. And these changes that are happening in the adult life are independent, or what they were thought they were independent of that diet during adulthood. And the first data from this type of research came from human research on the Dutch famine that happens on the World War II, that during 9 months there was a period where the energy restriction was huge in a population. And so there were mothers that were pregnant on the first, second, third, or the whole period, and they suffered different outcomes depending when they suffer these energy restriction. So, and I'm going to use the pens to mark some of the things, sorry. We can see that if the restriction was in the last third of gestation, there was less incidence of obesity. The reason of that is that's when the adipose tissue is forming. So there were direct impact on the adipose tissue. Now, when the problem was on the third of gestation, there was an increase in obesity. And the problem in statics, that's when the center that regulates appetite, it's being developed. So the problem on the energy efficiency or the restriction in energy in that period had an impact on the development of the hypothalamus. So that leads to the incidence of obesity.
Alejandro?
Yes.
I loaded the wrong slide set, so I'm going to take control for a second and switch you over.
Okay.
I realized it when I saw that there. Now we're at the right place. I'll give you back control.
Perfect. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. So what we can see from this data is that the restriction that happens on gestation continue in these people at the age of 50. So that's something that I remember when I was a kid, a lot of people say, oh, no, I'm not chubby, it's just my genetic. Okay, it could happen that was true. Now we have scientific proof to say whatever happened during the embryo and fetal development may impact on the adulthood of a person. This developed the theory of epigenetics, and epigenetics are hereditable changes in the gene expression that doesn't change the DNA sequence. So the sequence of the bases in the DNA is exactly the same. What it happens is the DNA get hypermethylated, or the histones that are proteins where the DNA turn around get acetylated, and that change how a gene can be expressed. And those changes can happen pass to the first, second, or third, and depends the genes up to the 12th generations. And here it's a little graph of that, and I hope that you can follow me. So you can see these circles there here, and I'm going to point one, are the histones. This molecule that we have here is the polymerase transferase 2, so it's the enzyme in charge to transcribe that gene. And then we have promoter region, in the promoter region, some promoter factors that bind and help the transcription of that. You can see the space that there is between each of these histones. When we have a hypermethylation or histone hypoacetylation, the charges of the DNA change and makes that these histones are more compact one to each other. So it's really, really hard for the transcription factors or the DNA polymerase to get into that DNA, so it makes harder the transcription of that gene. And this, we need to consider that it's what makes happen or going on this fetal programming. Now, there are some research now focused on that. I'm not going to focus too much on the molecular biology for the sake of the presentation, but for you to understand what was the biology behind or what we are going to cover today. So the original hypothesis was that if something happened during the womb of a mother, that will help the individual to be better, have a better outcome on that situation. Supposedly, if you have a kid that is, or a fetus that develops an energy restriction diet, probably that kid, when it's born, it's going to be born in a place where food is not a lot, it's not abundant. So it became efficient to be able to utilize that resources better. So if, and this is an example, if the uterine conditions are poor, example, low level of nutrition, the fetus will get adapted to that, changing this expression of genes. So when it's born in that condition, has a greater chance to survive. If we move that to, that was developed in humans, so if we try to extrapolate that to cattle, anytime that we do a metabolic or nutritional change in the mother during the gestation, that will produce an outcome different on the different offsprings. And most of the time, we are not aware, or we don't measure, or we don't consider that. And I hope that by the end of this talk, we can see that we need to be paying a little bit more attention on these things. Something else to think about is what's going on in the fetus during different times or different stages of the development. So if we have the 9 months of gestation on the x-axis, we can see that the first 2 we call embryonic stage, and from 9 months 2 to 9 are the fetal stage. The red line is the fetal growth. We can see that the fetal growth is minimum until the end of the gestation, where 2/3 of the growth happen during the last 2.5 to 3 months. But also depends where we have the treatment or the effect of the nutrient, will have different outcomes. We can see that early development, we have the brain and the cardiovascular that are forming. During the middle of the gestation, we have the formation of the muscle, kidney and pancreas. And at the end of the gestation, we have the adipogenesis, that is the formation of adipose cells, and the muscle hypertrophy, so the growth of muscles. So most of the studies that we are going to talk happens during this time. And you can see when we think on animal production, it's where the muscle and adipose tissue develop, and those are products that we may be interested on production, okay? And we need to understand how we can manage them to obtain a good or a quality product. Now, when we start to read or think on fetal programming, most of the studies were conducted in sheep, then in beef, and the last species is in dairy cattle. The reason why sheep is the model more used is the gestation model. It's on how things happen. It's very, very similar to human. So it's a good model to study human fetal development. So because of that, from farm animals, it's the most used. And we can see that, for example, 2/3 of the study in fetal programming for human, the model is rat and mice, but 14% is sheep. If we compare, it's the biggest one on production animals. Then we have swan as an 8%, guinea pigs 4%, apes 2%, and poultry only 2%. You can see that bovines are not used as a model for fetal programming in human, and that's part of the reason why there is more research on sheep, just because there is more money on there. Then we need to think that in the system that we are working in beef, when we do a fetal programming effect or we do something during the gestation, we are having a direct effect in the productive animals or in the performance. But in beef, we have two systems that work together, that do not work together, sorry. So we have the cow-calf operation, that's where we apply the treatment or we can manage this fetal programming, and we don't see anything, or I'm going to mention that we don't see most of results up to here in the cow-calf operation. All of the results are seen at the feedlot level, at the finishing. And there is very little integration between the cow-calf operation and feedlot systems, and that makes really hard to produce a good outcome through that, because if the cow-calf operation do not receive extra pennies for an extra work, they are not going to do it. And that's where feedlotters need to start to think how much they're going to pay for these calves if they're going to have a good quality product. And before I go and explain some of the data and the result from fetal programming, I'm going to mention that it's not just fetal programming, and it's really hard to sometimes to evaluate these differences, okay? And you can see here, this is a similar figure than before, where we have the fetal weight and the dates of stations, that most of the time depends the treatment that happened or the nutrition, the plane of nutrition on the mother, on the last third, the fetal weight or the birth weight could be different. And sometimes it's really hard to see if the difference on the feedlot are due to the physiology that happens here, or it's just a birth weight. So we need to think that any of these changes that are going to happen or change the uterus environment have an impact on the dam too, and this impact will be pre or postpartum. There is a group in Australia that did really, really nice work, and that they did multiple regressions trying to understand what was the main cause of the body weight at the finishing. And they were able to say that for every kilogram extra that at birth, the animals had 4.39 kilograms more at the feedlot. Okay, so it's just by the birth weight, each kilo difference in birth weight, it has more than 4 kilos different on the finishing. Similar to that, but not as big, is per kilogram difference at weaning, there is a 0.78 kilograms difference at finishing, and those two are additives. Okay, so they don't, both of them fit in the regression. So we need to think that sometimes we don't see difference in this fetal programming, but as I'm going to mention, sometimes we don't see difference in the birth weight or weaning weight on the calves or in the mother, so no difference at body weight, but something that we need to think, or we need to be more focused as researchers, is if we are not trying to, because the difference is so small, we cannot pick it up based on the statistic that we are using. And that's something that we need to be aware that maybe it is, and we don't know. So far, I'm going to present the data that we have do not show this difference, and I'm going to present it like that, but consider it could be also a mother effect directly and not a fetal program. I think to consider, and is that when we do research, the main idea of our research, we try to solve industry problems. That's when our research program became important. So if the problem is something that is just local and we try to fix that, that's something that it has an impact on the state. And in beef cattle, all these fetal programming start on the Great Plains in the United States, mainly because of the type of forage or feeding system that they have during the winter. Where, and you can see in the picture where you can have a winter grass or grazing during the winter, and that pasture has very low crude protein concentration. Sometimes they feed those animals crop residues, again, the same type of crude protein, low in crude protein. So protein supplementation was required, and they were not thinking on the mother at that time when all this started. They were just thinking, they were not thinking on the fetus, they were just thinking on the mother and how to meet the requirements of protein on the pregnant cow. Okay, so from that, that's how all this developed, and I'm going to start now to talk about results on protein nutrition and fetal programming. And most of the session you will see on the title that say FP, just too short for fetal programming. So one of the first studies, one of the studies you can see was cows were supplemented with 2% of crude protein, or a control that we saw supplementation. And the 2% crude protein, we are going to call them HP, high protein, and the non-supplemented LP. This study was conducted in multiple places, but they always supplement with 2% extra crude protein. And you can see, and this is, again, the supplementation was in the cow. This data is from the feedlot, and most of, if I'm not clarified, most of the data is in the offspring, okay, in the adult life of the offspring. You can see that there was no difference, no significant difference for the initial body weight, but the finishing body weight, the average daily gain, dry matter intake, and feed conversion ratio were different. You can see that the low protein had a lower body weight at finishing, lower average daily gain. They eat a little bit less, but when we put the efficiency of that less based on how much they ate, they were less efficient. They need to eat more to gain this less amount in comparison. So they need to eat 4.85 kilograms to eat 1 kilogram. So we can see, and again, as I mentioned before, these are multiple studies where they supplement protein, and you can see that, as I mentioned before, there were no difference at weaning or the starting finish lot, but most of the time, the calves on the non-supplemented, the born from non-supplemented cows had a lower birth weight at body weight at weaning. With this protein supplementation does not only affect growth in feedlot, but also has an impact on the reproductive performance of the daughters. So we can see in this study, they have a high protein and low protein, but they had also two different basal diets. One was the red bar is crop residues, and the other one is a winter grazing, okay? So we can see that when they were supplemented with protein, there was no difference on the pregnancy day. The body weight when they did pregnancy diagnosis. But on the case of low protein, when they did check for pregnancy, the body weight for the low protein cows or heifers were smaller. Now, if we compare age of puberty, the protein supplemented heifers or the protein supplemented daughters had a younger age. They reached puberty at a younger age. And you can see that they also had a greater pregnancy rate compared with the non-supplemented proteins. So a good thing with this fetal programming and protein that most of the results that we have go in the same trend. That protein supplementation in the cow has a good benefit effect on the performance of the offspring. Again, we don't know for some of these data if that's a real fetal programming effect or it's just that the cows that receive protein have a better body condition score at calving that allows them to have a better performance on the lactation period. One study, or one of the recent studies on protein supplementation, is very interesting because they work with 3 different doses of protein. So they had a control with no protein supplementations and 2 different types of protein supplementation, HP and LP. These ones seems to be, or that's how they call it, HP and LP, they have the same amount of crude protein, but what it changes where that protein works. So it was more or less rumen undegradable protein, okay? The HP had 59% of rumen undegradable protein, and the LP had only 34% of rumen undegradable protein. So they were trying to evaluate the effect or efficiency on the type of protein source. And we can see, sorry that it's in Spanish, but this is the treatment of the mothers could be control HP and LP. And we have the crude protein percentage, metabolizable protein. And you can see that the control mothers receive a diet with 8 to 11% crude protein. And the HP and the LP, again, had 2% more crude protein percentage. And when they analyzed the metabolizable protein, there was 631 grams per day, 800 and 733. Now, if we look at the NRC, the requirements of proteins for those type of animals, metabolizable protein, is 565, okay? So think on this number and these 3 numbers when we see the results, okay? So all the diet were above the requirements of metabolizable protein. So when we go up the gross or reproductive, there were no difference. So it is possible that because the 3 diet at that time, they were providing more protein than what the NRC recommends or mentioned that required for those type of animals. So going back to the first set of results, yes, protein supplementation had an impact on fetal programming, but most of the time that happens when the basal diet doesn't meet the requirements. If the basal diet meets the requirements, there is not need for extra protein supplementation. Now, when we go, that's just based on the data before from the growth of the animal. When we talk about the carcass characteristics, there is only one paper that didn't see any difference on carcass characteristics. Now, there are many papers, or at least 3, that mention that an improvement in hot carcass weight and marbling score due to protein supplementation. Also, Larson et al. In 2009 showed that there is not just a change in the marbling, but also the amount of marbling based on the yield rate. And remember, yield rate is value that we use here in the state to pay the animals that goes 1 to 5. 3 would be ideal, and it depends on the amount of fat and muscle. Now, something to consider is that it just not depends on the diet, and we can see in this paper from Larson and collaborators that it doesn't depend just on the mother diet, but there is an interaction between the mother and the finishing diet, okay? And that's something that we need to start to understand more on what will be the best diet for feedlot cattle based on the nutrition of the mother. We know that the nutrition of the mother changed the behavior of those animals, but we are not able to customize diet so far based on that. The second part, or the second nutrient that we are going to talk is energy and fetal programming. And sorry, energy is not a nutrient, but it's a set of nutrients that we are going to talk within energy. And the first part is mentioned that there was a huge restriction, 30 to 70% in early and mid gestation in beef cows that did not have any impact on the offspring performance. So when we think on this one, it's when does it happen, or when it's more common, the feed restriction. So during this time, this early and mid gestation, most of the beef producers, we have it in early spring. And that's a time where feed is not energy is not a limited factor. So most of the restriction we have at the end of the gestation period, that is during winter, and that's for most of the cases that I'm aware, I'm not sure in tropical countries, but in temperate and subtropical countries, temperate countries, it's very, very common not have enough feed during the winter. So this study, what they did is they had, in a 2x2 factorial, there was a treatment imposed to the mother, and then was a treatment imposed to the animals when they were weaned. And we can see that the mouse were supplemented with 1.8 kilograms per day of a supplement, and that was just to maintain body condition score. And then they were supplemented with 1.2 kilograms per day, and this was a restriction on intake. Okay, so the animals were in a negative energy balance, NEB. When the calves were weaned, the offspring were also fed a controlled diet ad libitum, or restrict 27%. This was done for around 140 days, and after that period of 140 days, the animals went to the feedlot, and here we have the results from the feedlot. And the most important thing that there was an interaction on the results based on the two treatments. We can see, and this interaction was when the calves were born from the negative energy balance and fed a controlled diet, had the lowest average daily gain in the feedlot. But if the calves were born from a negative energy balance cows and were restricted, when they went to the feedlot performance, they outperformed the rest of the animals. So that's something to think about, that depending the diet or the type of environment where this calf came from, we can modify the type of management that we do to obtain the best from those calves. This study is not in a negative energy balance, but we have cows that were foraging a nature range, a pasture, or an improved pasture with fertilized with nitrogen and better quality of dry matter intake and better green area. And we can see that the birth weight was not different, but the weaning weight was different, the finishing weight was different, greater average daily gain in the feedlot, a greater weight on the hot carcass, and also that increase in weight was putting a little bit more extra back fat. So we can see, and depends the product that we want to produce, if we just produce kilograms of animals, having offspring coming from just an improved pasture maybe beneficial, but if we have a problem that they don't want us to buy fat because of the market doesn't want that, using this type of system in the cow, maybe not the most beneficial one. So again, as a little conclusion on this one, if the cow is in a negative energy balance, we can modify that based on the diet that we can give them to the steer. But most of the cases, a cow with a good energy balance will produce calves with better birth weight. Now again, is this a fetal programming or a cause effect? For us biologists that do research, it's very important to try to understand that a producer, he or she just wants bigger calves, more kilograms or more pounds of calves win. So for them, it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's something to consider too. Another thing is, okay, that those studies that I just mentioned was on different energy levels, high and low. But what happens if we feed the same amount of energy, but the energy coming from different products? And that's very common that sometimes we want the animals to be not in a positive energy balance, but we don't want them to be in a negative energy balance. So it depends where we are, it's where we can feed them. Some people will use soy hulls, some people will use hay, some people will use meal and wheat meal. So it depends where we are. It's this byproduct or this extra feed that we can use. So the question is, if we have two sources of nutrients at similar price, which one should we use? So I'm going to talk a little bit about isoenergetic diet, a little bit of the effect of fatty acids, and then go into different energy sources like corn and hay and the steer's grain. And with that, I'm going to talk not just in performance, but a little bit on metabolism. So the first study conducted using fats as modifiers of the fetal program that I am aware is the one conducted by Banta and collaborators in 2011. What they did is they took two different types of sunflower seed, one rich in oleic and one rich in linoleic, and they fed those to the cows during gestation, and they didn't see or they didn't observe any difference on the offspring. Now, a recent paper from Marquez et al., what they did is they fed calcium salts of a saturated monosaturated mix or a polyunsaturated that was an omega-6, omega-3 mix of fatty acids. In this study from Marquez et al., they didn't find any difference on that performance or any difference on the offspring at weaning, but they saw some difference at finishing. So when the calves were fed a polyunsaturated fatty acid, there was an increase in average daily gain, in body weight, increase in core carcass weight, increase in longissimus dorsi area, so a ribeye area, bigger ribeye area, and more marbling. That study with Marquez in beef, it's very similar to the studies that we did here and that they did in Florida too in different models. And here I have on the top of the chart the model, dairy, beef, and sheep, and fatty acid supplementations, for example, in dairy with 1.8% of the dry matter intake. That study that I just showed is 190 grams. That is, again, around 1 and 2%, 1.5 and 2% of body weight of dry matter intake. And then we did many studies with 0.41 or 2% supplementation of fatty acid. And you can see that all of them, there is an increase in finishing body weight on beef and sheep. And in dairy, when we supplement with fat, there is an increase in milk yield, 10 to 20% on the first lactation. Based on some of the results that we have here, my question is, are we changing the metabolism of these animals in general to make it more efficient so they grow better? Or we are just changing the dry matter intake? It's just the animals eat more. based on the results that we have, it seems that the animals are eating more, and that increase in feed intake or dry matter intakes allows the animals to eat more. So there is no differences in efficiency in feed conversion ratio. So some producers say, I don't need to feed them less, why I will go, but some people will know that an increase in body weight in 5% means that the animals are going to leave the feedlot sooner, and that's a positive advantage when you work with multiple cycles of finishing in 1 year. So when we think on fatty acids, the results are not as consistent as we saw in protein. Part of these differences could be that and I didn't present one study that in beef that we did with the infusion of oil, pure oil, fish oil and soybean oil. But the results from the calcium salts of fatty acid, the oil seeds or the oils are different. In the calcium salt, we saw an improving performance. In the oil seed, there was not improved performance, and when we infuse oil, we fed them oil directly, there was a loss in performance. So we still don't know if that's the different source, or it's just that the basal diet of those animals were different, and that may have an impact on what happened. And the same, we don't know what was the difference on the offsprings during the finishing period. So it is possible that there are so many interactions. Up to now, what I can say is that the calcium salts have a benefit effect, and that's what is in the market. Many different companies have some of those ones, and I think it's a good way to improve a little bit. And the amount needed is not extra. We saw differences from the supplementation of 0.4% of the dry matter intake, which is very, very little, and it doesn't have an impact on the cost of the diet at the end. Another example with isoenergetic diets was a study that we conduct here with Senior Vanstead. She was the one that introduced me to this biological model, where in this area in Ohio, in the Midwest, cow-calf operations are smaller, and sometimes it's a part-time job, and during the winter, it's common to feed them hay. Now, it happens sometimes when we have very dry springs and summers that the hay cost is very expensive. So producers try to use different sources, and sometimes they use wholesale corn or the Steelers grain. So the diets we're trying to, you can see that the energy that each compound has or each feedstuff has is different. So we need to feed less corn or the Steelers grain to reach the same amount of energy intake in the animal. So in that study that Amy conducted, where she fed hay, corn, or the Steelers grain, and again, it was isoenergetic diet, we can see that there was a tendency on the initial body weight on the feedlot, where the animals, the calves born from corn, were the heaviest. Now, the final body weight was no different, was the same, and that was because it was a set final body weight, okay? And when the animals reached 500 kilos, 510 kilos average, they were going into the feedlot. So there was no difference in average daily gain, there was no difference in dry matter, but because the final body weight was set and the initial body weight was bigger, then the calves born from cows fed corn were less days in the feedlot. Something to consider is that also those animals had the lower intramuscular fat, the lowest marbling score. Okay, and this is intramuscular fat measured as ether extract. So that's something to think. Okay, are we going to get paid by quality or you're gonna just pay by amount. And these are tools that we can use to manage this end product that we are getting. So what Amy thought is, based on those results, that she was changing the metabolism of the calves when she fed the different type of energy sources to the mothers. So she conducted a glucose tolerant test, and you can see on this figure, so she infused glucose on the jugular, and she measured glucose concentration at different times. So we have glucose concentration in the Y and time after the bolus on X. And you can see as soon as she infused glucose, glucose went up and then went down logically, and there was no difference to treatment. But when we compare that with the insulin concentration, we can see that the calves, and sorry, I don't know if you can see the marks, but the squares are hay, the circles are corn, and the diamonds are the steer strain. We can see that the calves born from cows fed the steer strain had a greater insulin response, so they were less sensitive. Remember that these ones were the ones in the middle on intramuscular fat. So doing that, we are changing somehow the metabolism of the animal, and that may impact on the performance of those animals. So from that, the conclusion is that it's not just energy that we need to feed the animal, because isoenergetic diets with different nutrients, it could be corn, distillers grains, or hay, or even different type of fat, has an effect on the offspring performance. Some of these ones we know so far that are due to changes in insulin metabolism and insulin sensitivity. We have some data that's not published, and that's why I didn't put it there, but we observed some difference on the gene expression of neuropeptides that regulate appetite. So we are changing the biology or the basic biology to see some of these performance difference. Some of these lead to a change in fat deposition. So we need to think, again, the market that we are targeting. Here in the States, we want marbling, and that's a positive outcome because of they have a better price. Now, we need to think that some countries do not like marbling because they cook in different ways, so they have different marketing ways, and so we need to understand these mechanisms to try to produce the better end product. Something that I forgot to pass on the outline, but there is a nice study conducted on fetal program and minerals. So this study, what they fed is 3 types of diets: a controlled diet with no supplementation, an inorganic sources of minerals, that there were sulfate sources of copper, cobaltum, magnesium, and zinc, or the same minerals at the same concentration but in a chelate source or an organic source. Okay, so it's just amount of minerals compared with none, and then comparing sources of minerals. And we can see, and again, we can check the p-values. There was no difference at birth weight, but we have a difference at weaning weight. And we can see that this weaning weight, the animals on the control, no mineral supplementation, were smaller, lighter than the ones in the inorganic minerals, and the organic or the chelate forms of mineral have the heavier body weight at weaning. There was a tendency at growing, so in the middle of the feedlot period, that followed the same trend, and when they estimate from the hot carcass weight, the finishing, it was similar, a trend where the non-supplemented was a lighter and the chelate mineral was a heavier. And that's also in hot patterns way. So let me go back to this one. I thought I had it. How many times do we really think on the minerals that we are supplementing? If they are in a pasture-based system, we just give them a batch of minerals. If we were lucky, it's not just salt, but we need to see if these almost 20 kilos difference in the feedlot are worth to pay for those cents per day that it costs during the last 2 months to feed the cows. So as a general conclusion, I need to think that we as nutritionists need to do a better job in cow-calf operations. Most of the time, cow-calf operations are the ones that we as nutritionists do not pursue. We work a lot of dairies without feedlots, and we just leave the cow to be free range and harvesting calves. Okay, that's not the case anymore. We need to be more focused in what we do that, because that we are producing the calves for the next system. There are probably many things that have a fetal program effect, but we just don't know them yet. And what's the impact of those based on the finishing diet too? The other thing is the fetal nutritionists need to know where the calves come from. Sometimes the cow-calf operation is not going to change because of cost of changing. They will not have a better income for that. So we need to start to know where are we buying those calves, because we may need to start to do different diets if those calves were from a restricted pasture versus not, or if those calves came from one type of forage or the other type of forage, or high protein or low protein supplementation. Something that I would like you to take as a take-home message is that maybe there are many things that we are doing in those pregnant cows that are having an impact on fetal programming. Some of those things could be good, some of those things could not be good. Maybe we are doing detrimental things to those calves. And because we don't know them, we just assume that it's okay. So it's a good point to start to read and try to go in more detail, trying to understand a little bit more on what are we doing and what's the impact of those calves. Something that I didn't put there, but it's a philosophical reflection. If we are going to buy calves, I know that some feedlotters do that. We need to pay extra for those calves that always perform better. So we need to somehow push the cow-calf operators to produce better calves. And how we do that is by training them, talking with them, telling them how the calves perform, and understand what they were fed during gestation, those cows, to try to maintain those type of things. And if they do that extra job, they need to get that extra pennies per pound, per kilo. Because if they don't see a difference at the end in the pocket, they are not going to do an extra job. But if we're going to have some differences in performance because those cows are better, let's share that extra income with the person that is producing our cows. At the end, I want to thank some of my collaborators like Amy Rodan, Steve Lurch, and Francis Fluharty, that they were part of the people that introduced me to fetal programming. And then Danielle Coleman, she was master student with me working in fetal programming in fatty acids. And the same that Dr. Carmen Martin. And then Mauricio Giuliori and Dr. Angelaine Charles, they helped me a lot of data on fetal programming and calves, on dairy calves and health. So saying that, I want to share a little bit of our experimental station with you, and I'm open for questions.
Okay. Ale, thank you very much. I'm going to take control back over for just a few minutes so that we can do some housekeeping details. Nice picture, by the way. It certainly looks like it's blue skies and green grass. So remember, anybody, if you have questions during this time, take advantage of my talking and put those either in the chat window or in the question and answer window. We will alternate questions coming from Paula in Argentina. And Ali, I'm going to mute you so that you can grab a drink or anything you might need to. We'll alternate questions, and when we're done with questions, we'll sign off. So first of all, I want to invite you to join us next month as we're joined by Dr. Alfredo Di Costenzo from the University of Minnesota. Alfredo received his BS from ITESM campus Querétaro in Mexico. He attained his master's and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. At UMN, he has appointments in both teaching and research. His research focus is nutrition and management factors affecting the biologic and economic efficiency of cow-calf and feedlot operations. The evaluation of I was supposed to progress these slides and I didn't. Sorry. The evaluation of alternative feeds and the feeding and management strategies to improve economic efficiencies is another area of his research. He also researches the determination of nutrient requirements to enhance economic and environmentally sustainable beef production. His talk next month will focus on backgrounding in beef cattle. Be sure to join us on June 13th at 1 p.m. So we want to thank you. We want to thank you for joining us. I especially want to thank my co-host, Paula Torillo. She is sponsored by Rock River Labs and Bio4 Argentina. We conspired probably 6 months ago to create a beef-focused webinar based on our successful collaboration in the dairy-based The Nutritionist. We hope you enjoyed this one. It seemed very appropriate to start it with fetal programming. I also want to thank AB Vista. They are our English language webinar sponsor. In addition to Dr. Di Costenzo, the June webinar, our upcoming Beef Nutritionist webinars and dates are August 15th at 1 p.m. Dr. Danny Fox, Professor Emeritus from Cornell University. He's going to speak on factors affecting the accuracy of predicting performance in growing beef cattle. September 12th, we have Dr. Jonas Sarturi from Texas Tech University, and his talk is loosely titled Beef Nutrition and Metabolism. Then we're going to finish up the Beef Nutritionist webinar series on October 10th with Dr. Nicholas DiLorenzo from University of Florida. He's going to talk about using forages efficiently to minimize environmental impact. As always, archived webinars of this and past The Nutritionist webinars can be watched online at agmodelsystems.com. Look for them under the Webinars tab. There's a little delay in posting as I take care of all the editing on the recordings. Webinars can also be downloaded for offline viewing by clicking on the Vimeo logo in the video viewing window. Podcast conversion of the audio from the webinars can be downloaded from the podcast under knowledge-based tabs. So please remember to join us in June. I'm going to open up Ale's microphone again, and we'll see if Paula has some questions. I do not have any questions yet in my question and answer window. If anybody wants to write them in, go ahead. So here we go. Ale, you're back on, and Paula, do you want me to ask for you, or do you want to ask?
I can try.
Okay, go ahead.
question one from Argentina. Ale, considering we usually don't know precisely body weight or energy content of feeds, do you think following body condition score of the cows during pregnancy would be enough to check energy balance?
Okay, so if we don't know the feed content or the nutrient content for our feed, and what we have is body condition score, that would be a perfect tool. Now, a perfect tool to have something, body condition score tells a lot. That tells you that the animals are in negative energy balance, so that has two impacts, one on the cow and one on the fetus. On the cow, we know that if it's losing body condition score, it's in that negative energy balance, those animals are going to have less energy for calving. They're going to spend more energy, more from the total energy that they have on the energy of calving. And the milk, the colostrum quantity are not going to be the best, the same like the milk yield. We are going to struggle with those animals to gain some feed. After they calve, they're going to try to milk a little bit or produce milk, and they need to gain that body condition score to reproduce again. So we need to check, in that sense, it's a good tool to have, that if we don't know what nutrient they are, there's nothing that we can do with that, and sometimes the cost of the analysis is not, you cannot pay it based on what you're going to get from your calves. If no one's going to pay you more for a good calf. But the body condition score is a very, very good tool, and it will allow you to say, okay, at least you need to supplement something, because if not, you're going to lose too much body condition score that will have repercute in many, many, many other outcomes, not just in the performance of the calf on the finishing, but you will have reproductive problems in those cows as you want to breed them for the next year. I don't know if that answered the questions. No, sorry, I went on that part. That's for the cow. On the calf, if we don't know the nutrient, we don't know if we are doing something good for the fetal programming. Most of the cases, if the pasture quality is not good and the cow is losing body condition score, those calves are gonna, the forage will gonna be low in proteins. So we saw that low protein in the diets in the mothers have an effect on the outcomes of the offspring. So I will try to supplement with something that has a nice source of good protein. Could be soy hulls. I'm trying to go with cheap sources. Soy hulls, could be some urea and molasses, depends where you are. It could be wheat mills. I will try to use some of that to improve not just the energy balance, but also the protein on the mother and on the fetus.
Okay. Paula, do you have another question?
Yes. Continuing with this, how much would you expect to increase body condition score?
How much do you want?
And in which period?
Okay, so I don't have here, sorry, on my presentation. Let me see if I have something that I can. And we need to think on body condition scores. Depends where you are, and I'm going to try to see if I can share a little bit my screen. So I'm going to try to show some pictures. Oh, hold on. Let me see. Sorry for the change in. So this will be and again, this is a presentation from Amy Relling, or pictures that she sent us. You can see these are cows that in the 1 to 9 body condition score, I would prefer those animals to be in a 5 or 6 body condition score. I know that in Argentina they use the similar to the dairy scale, the 1 to 5 instead of 1 to 9. So they should be 3, 3.5 in body condition score. Less than that, you will start to have problems in performance on the cow on reproductive, and I can send some of those data if someone is interested. But you don't want animals that are less than a 4 maybe body condition score. So if you go to the 1 to 5 scale, they need to be around 275. That would be the lower optimum that I would like to go. Did that answer the question?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm not sure if this is a very good one. My experience and understanding, have there been any studies that have sort of compared the difference between maybe the fetal programming that happens in dairy steers that are then used for beef compared with beef animal steers? Because I'm going to make a hazard a guess that maybe the plane of nutrition is quite a bit different in the dairy cow during that fetal period, and how has there been anything that's looked at that?
There are very few. That's a very good question. So there are not many places where they use dairy calves for research model in feed lot. There are some, not many. So one of the differences that it has, the model, dairy versus beef, that during the dry period or the non-lactating period in the dairy cow, they are fed a diet that meets their requirements. Most of those cows, they are not grazing during the winter, so they are under, it's a low energy compared with a dairy lactating diet, but it's not that below the requirements. So it's very odd the case where you will find a dairy cow that it has a low negative energy balance on that last time of gestation. Okay, now if we think that's just for energy and protein, most of the time they will not be a problem on dairy calves because they will be met. Now if we think on the study conducted by the group in Florida by Santos and Staple, and they work in commercial dairy farms, and there is a difference in growth when they feed different sources of fatty acids. So it is possible that fatty acids is a better tool to play with fetal programming in calves from dairy cows, that you may have an impact in greater body weight. Now, depends the dairy model that you use, they have a high quality marbling, a Holstein and Jerseys compared with some breeds. So it is possible that will be another aspect to look at. If we can able to improve it better based on the fatty acid studies from Washington in Marquez, they saw bigger longissimus dorsi, ribeye area. So if we can achieve that in dairy calves, that will be a good tool. And I don't think by now that someone studied that, but that's an interesting topic to follow.
Thank you. I think that Paula has a question now from Argentina. Go ahead, Paula.
Yes, I have a question from Carlos. Talking about the research on protein supplementation, how much time were the non-supplemented animals with protein deficiency?
The winter. So depends the length of the winter. Most of these studies were conducted over 2 years on different farms. So winter here start depends the year. Could start in November, could start in January. So most of these cases, and when they do it on research, they focus on the last 90 days, the last 78 days of gestation. So, and again, based on how the research was developed was because the animals were outside on native grasses where it's very, very low in crude protein. So if you try to compare that to Argentina, depends where you are and the year. If you know that the winter was very dry, probably you will have similar problems. So it will be a good thing to supplement. Or if you're gonna buy calves and you know that the winter was cold and dry, you know that you will have a poor performance in those calves because the diet was poor at the beginning.
Great. I have another. May I, Marian?
Yes, go ahead, Paula.
Okay. This question is from Pedro. Which would be your practical recommendation to increase muscle and not fat deposition in feed animals regarding the diet of the mother, of the cow?
Could you repeat it, Paula?
Yes. Your practical recommendation to increase muscle and not fat deposition in feedlot animals regarding the diet of the cow.
So you want to improve marbling without affecting total fat deposition?
I really don't know. To increase muscle
Okay,
deposition
muscle.
and not fat. Muscle,
okay.
Yes.
So and this goes a little bit, sorry for all my colleagues. If you don't want fat, you want muscle, you need to breed cattle that just muscle and not fat. That's the first thing. Now, if you have an animal, and that's the thing, is you need to try to put a cow-calf operation working together with feedlotters, and that's not most of the cases. So if you work with crosses of any Angus or Hereford and a Bos Indicus, those will have more muscle and less fat deposition. The other way that, and this is a little bit getting away of the fetal programming, okay? There are other ways that you can do it. Be sure that your cow has a support the growth of the calf. If you have cows that are adult body weight, 900 pounds, 400 kilograms, you cannot produce calves that are finishing steers that are 500 kilograms. That's impossible. You're going to be producing fat. In that case, you need to work on what's the basis, the genetics that you have, and try to develop that. From the results again, in fetal programming, most of the studies were conducted here in the States, and the idea is look for marbling, okay, intramuscular fat, because it gets paid more for that. There is an increase in the price. At the point that sometimes it's better to have a prime animal, so a high marbling, and lose a little bit of the yield rate because it has a little bit extra back fat. The back fat, you can trim it with a knife, and that shouldn't be a problem for the consumer, but you cannot put intramuscular fat. Now, sometimes the consumer doesn't want to see the fat, and I was the case. I didn't want to see marbling until you really try it and taste it. So it's also a way to work there. Now, if your animal is getting too fat too fast, you need to work on the energy. The basic energy that the animals need to eat, it needs to be allowed in a growth. So you cannot have a 1.5, 1.6 kilograms of gain per day in an animal. It's going to be of that 30-40% fat. So you need to restrict the gain to allow the muscle to grow. Now, sometimes that's not the most profitable for a feedlot because you want good animals that grow fast. So it's a complex mix of things. I don't think there is only one tool that you can use, but if you are a cow-calf operator and you need to provide calves for a feedlot, try to work on the genetics. animals that allow to more muscle. That will be the faster way to do a change. As a nutritionist, work on the calves that allows that if you know that they get fat soon, try to restrict the energy in the diet. It could be more forage or it could be restricted intake. Both of them work. From the fetal programming, again, there are no one that look for the fat study from Marquez. They observe a better longitudinal torsi area, but also more marbling. So that's beneficial. Now, on the study on forage and energy, the ones that were born in a native pasture, not in a improved pasture, those calves gain less by the fetal programming and they have less back fat. So you can manage that reducing a little bit. And again, these animals were in a positive energy balance, not negative, but the cows were not gaining weight. So they were at maintenance, not in a positive energy balance. So if the cow is in a positive energy balance during gestation, that may have an impact on fat deposition too. So I don't know if that answers the question, and probably that can be base of a debate, and we can follow that later too if it's needed.
Paula, keep going.
Yes, I have another question, and then I think I have some comments regarding your answer, but I cannot read and talk at the same time.
Do you want me to read the question while you work on the comment?
Okay.
I could do that. It's the question from Danny?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a question from Danny in Argentina. As you did with energy sources, have you done some work with different sources of protein? Can you tell our audience something about the non-protein nitrogen supplementation?
Okay, so far the only one that I saw comparing protein sources was the one that they use, the Steelers grains and corn gluten meal. And they try to compare rumen digestible and non-digestible. Sadly, the control that was not protein supplemented in that study there was above the requirements already. So they didn't need the supplementation, and in that case, there was no difference. From the biology perspective, sometimes we heard too much dairy nutritionists with that model that it's producing, 100 pounds per day, 50 kilos. And they talk a lot of ruminant digestible protein and amino acids that need to reach, limiting amino acid that need to reach the small intestine. In the beef, and this again, there is no data that support that. This is what I assume. In a cow-calf operation, that cows that it's restricted its protein, we can use sources of protein that are not amino acids. So we can use non-nitrogen protein. So we can use urea. We can use that. Again, what we need. Remember that most of the studies they supplement with an extra 2% of crude protein. So we can use a little bit of a urea source for those cows that will allow to have a cheap supplement. Now, something that is not related to fetal programming but to protein supplementations, there are many studies here in the States and some in Europe where they didn't feed protein every day. They fed protein every 2 or 3 days. And based on the oscillation on the nitrogen metabolism in cows, there were no differences. They were fed every day that if they were fed every 2 or 3 days. So sometimes it's not that we need to have a feed bank full of a protein source, but if we have something like soy hulls or wheat meals, I'm thinking on that we can have soybean meal or sunflower meal too, but I'm trying to think in cheap sources for calf operations, that we can feed them once twice or three times a week, and we don't need to fill the feed banks every day. That's a benefit for cow-calf operators too.
Okay, thank you. Paula has a question or a comment. Here we go. Go ahead, Paula.
Yes. Ale, knowing weaning weights in the USA are different from ours, what would we prefer in our country? Focus on protein or energy? And based on regarding energy source, based on carbs or fats?
You know, these I need to depends the system where we are. I saw good producers and not that good producers. So most of the time, the person that is trying to improve, the room to improve, and it's always smaller every time that they do something. So we need to start to think what's the biggest problem, and from that move forward. It's every time depends. Most of the time in the north of Argentina we have better winters than in the south of Argentina. So it depends where in Argentina the person is, how the winter is going to be. But most of the time are associated low quality forage and winter, or the last third of gestation. So if we start with that, the low quality forage, it has cellulose, but it doesn't have protein. Because the animal doesn't have proteins, the bacteria do not grow. If the bacteria do not grow, they cannot degrade that cellulose. So that animal has a negative energy balance and a negative nitrogen balance, both in one animal. The addition of rumen-degradable proteins will allow the bacteria to grow a little bit more and be able to break down cellulose and obtain some energy. So that I assume that most of the cases the forages will have 6, 7, maybe 8% of protein, and we don't need more than 9 or 10. So it's just a little bit more extra protein will take care on the most of the day-to-day problems in winter. Will solve the deficiency in protein and will help with the energy balance, both at the same time. Now, if for some reason there is a really, really horrible winter, cold winter, okay, we need to think on amount of dry matter. You know, if they don't have anything to eat, there is nothing, you know, most of the time we put the picture like I showed you before or the one that is now, and most of the time in cow-calf operation, we cannot get that during the winter. So we need to, on those cases where there is no forage growing, we need to think on the energy balance, not in the protein, because it's the first lag. Once we solve that problem, and solving that problem, you know, if the animals do not lose body condition score, we are going to be improving not just the weaning weight and all those things on the calves, but also the reproductive performance on the cows. And again, the system will produce kilograms of calves at the end of the year, and that's what we need to do by improving the growth of the calf, but also by improving reproductive performance. So if we don't target, by targeting just one thing, we forget about the other one, we are not doing our job. So, and you mentioned something about the weaning weight, the differences in weaning weight, but that's a combination of two simple things. Bigger cows that allows to have bigger genetics, and independent of the nutrition, there are maybe they are 1 or 2 months more with the ewe. The average weaning age is 7 months, not 6. So you have there a 1 month more with a better genetic or different genetic that allows the animal to have a bigger weaning weight. But when we think on the biology of the cows, it's the same. And I don't know if that answered the whole question.
I think so.
Yes, I think so.
All right, thanks. Paula and I are both out of questions, and so we both want to thank you. Paula, I left you unmuted, so you can thank Ale.
Yes, thank you very much, Ale. It was great.
Yes, it was. This is our first, so very exciting to have you start off for us. I want to remind everybody that's still with us to make sure they join us next month, and we'll have Alfredo Di Costenzo, and also anybody who also joins our webinars in the evening. Paula and I will be back in place this afternoon with a webinar starting at 6 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. That's New York time. And we'll be talking with Phil Cardoso this afternoon. So again, Dr. Relling, thank you so much for joining us. You did a great job. It's nice to have somebody so adept at all of the webinar things. And we look forward to another nutritionist. I'm going to sign out unless anybody has anything to say.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't know that it was the first, so you put a little bit more extra pressure when I started. But if anyone wants to follow this, in my email, it's on the webpage of the High State. And so just write me an email, and I can follow that without any problem.
Yes. Oh, wait. I have a question, maybe. Let me see. I see a window. Oh, nope. I just have a comment that said, very good. And I will ask you now, is it okay to share your slide set as a PDF with everybody when we share the recording?
Yes, no problem.
All right. And I will make sure that your email address is available when I send out the recording, and that may be a little while. But when I send that out, I will make sure that they have your email address so that they can contact you.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see some of you this evening, maybe. All right. Bye.
Bye.